Japan's Izumo class has become one of the most carefully discussed naval platforms in the country's post-war history, not because of a single dramatic announcement, but because of the quiet tension between what these ships can now do and what Japan is still willing to call them. At the center of the debate is not steel, aircraft, or sensors, but language. The refusal to label Izumo or Kaga as aircraft carriers reveals far more about Japan's political culture, legal traditions, and public psychology than about naval engineering itself. From a purely operational perspective, the transformation of the Izumo class is no longer controversial. Originally introduced as helicopter destroyers, optimized for anti-submarine warfare and fleet command, both ships have undergone progressive modifications that allow them to support short takeoff and vertical landing fighter operations. Reinforced flight decks, revised heat-resistant coatings, changes to aviation support systems, and updated command and control arrangements have moved the class well beyond its original scope. The introduction of F-35B fighters into Japan's force structure was always intended to pair with these ships, even if that intention was expressed cautiously at the time of procurement. By the middle of the current decade, the practical implications are clear. The Izumo class can now host fixed-wing combat aircraft, extend air defense coverage over maritime task groups, and provide flexible response options in situations where land-based airfields may be unavailable or politically sensitive. In capability terms, this represents a meaningful expansion of Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force reach and resilience. Yet despite this reality, official documents and political statements continue to avoid the term aircraft carrier, opting instead for carefully constructed alternatives such as multi-role destroyer or aircraft-capable escort. This linguistic discipline is not accidental. In Japan, terminology carries legal and moral weight. The word carrier is deeply associated with offensive naval power, preemptive strike capability, and memories of Imperial Japan's wartime posture. While the post-war Constitution does not explicitly prohibit aircraft carriers, it does enshrine a principle of defensive orientation that has shaped policy interpretation for decades. Successive governments have relied on careful framing to demonstrate that new capabilities remain consistent with this principle, even as the regional security environment has evolved. Calling Izumo a carrier would immediately raise questions about intent rather than capability. It would invite constitutional debate, empower political opposition, and potentially fracture the fragile consensus that supports incremental defense modernization. By contrast, maintaining alternative terminology allows policymakers to argue continuity rather than rupture. The ship changes, but the doctrine, at least in its official presentation, does not. Public opinion reflects this sensitivity. Japanese society is not uniformly opposed to stronger defense capabilities, especially as missile threats, maritime pressure, and regional uncertainty have increased. Polling and media commentary show broad acceptance of the idea that Japan must adapt to a harsher strategic environment. However, acceptance is conditional. Many citizens distinguish between practical defense improvements and symbolic shifts that appear to abandon post-war restraint. The Izumo class sits precisely at this boundary. For supporters of the program, the argument is pragmatic. The ships are defensive tools designed to protect sea lanes, support allied operations, and ensure rapid response in emergencies. They do not carry large air wings, lack catapults, and are not intended for sustained power projection in distant theaters. In this view, the carrier label is misleading, importing foreign concepts that do not align with Japanese doctrine or force structure. Avoiding the term is therefore seen as accurate rather than evasive. Critics, however, worry less about technical distinctions and more about trajectory. They argue that once a platform capable of operating fighters exists, the line between defense and offense becomes blurred. From this perspective, the reluctance to use the carrier label appears as an attempt to soften public reaction rather than a genuine reflection of capability limits. Small protests and critical editorials have emerged around deployments and modifications, not because of immediate fear, but because of concern over gradual normalization of expanded military roles. What is notable is the absence of mass opposition. Unlike earlier periods of defense controversy, the Izumo debate has unfolded in a relatively calm public space. This suggests a broader shift in Japanese attitudes. The question is no longer whether Japan should defend itself robustly, but how openly it should redefine the language and symbols associated with that defense. Many citizens seem comfortable with the reality of enhanced capability as long as it is introduced without rhetorical confrontation. From a strategic standpoint, Izumo represents a deliberate compromise. Japan gains operational flexibility while preserving political stability. The ships enhance interoperability with allies, particularly in maritime air operations, without requiring a formal doctrinal leap. By avoiding provocative labels, Japan signals continuity to domestic audiences while quietly demonstrating adaptation to external observers. Comparisons with other navies highlight how distinctive this approach is. Countries such as the United Kingdom and Italy openly describe similar platforms as carriers, framing them as normal components of modern naval forces. Japan's refusal to do so does not reflect technological inferiority, but cultural and historical specificity. Strategic culture matters, and Japan's experience has produced a preference for understatement rather than declaration. In this sense, the Izumo class is as much a political instrument as a military one. It allows Japan to test the limits of post-war norms without breaking them outright. Each deployment, exercise, and modification is accompanied by careful explanation rather than celebratory rhetoric. This incrementalism may appear frustrating to outside observers, but domestically it has proven effective in maintaining legitimacy. Looking ahead, the central issue is not whether Japan will eventually accept the carrier label, but whether it needs to. The ships will continue to operate, the F-35B will become a routine part of maritime defense planning, and the public will gradually become accustomed to the new normal. Over time, the symbolic power of terminology may fade as practice overtakes perception. For now, Japan's choice remains deliberate. By refusing to call Izumo a carrier, the country preserves a narrative of defensive continuity while quietly acknowledging strategic reality. This balance between restraint and adaptation defines contemporary Japanese defense policy. The Izumo class does not signal a return to past militarism, nor does it represent a static defense posture frozen in history. Instead, it embodies a uniquely Japanese path forward, one that prioritizes legitimacy, caution, and consensus, even as the security environment demands change. In the end, the question is not what Izumo is called, but what Japan believes itself to be. The answer, at least for now, is a nation willing to evolve its capabilities while remaining deeply conscious of its past and careful about how that evolution is described.